Okay. Hello, welcome to the Flokk Digital Roundtable. My name is Lauren, and I'm the Senior Furniture Consultant for the Architecture and Design community here in London for Flokk UK. I'm joining you from our London showroom in Clerkenwell, and I'd like to introduce our two guests this morning, Kirsty, also known as the Travelling Ergonomist, and Tim Oldman from Leesman, CEO of Leesman. Today we're here to talk about how people want to work, and Tim is the CEO of Leesman, a company he founded, who just completed an incredible survey of more than 50,000 people newly working from home. We will discuss the data from the survey with Kirsty, who is an ergonomist and founder of The Travelling Ergonomist. She is an expert at helping people create personalized and healthy working setups at their home or in their work. And during the discussion, those of you logging in, feel free to ask any questions in the comments. We will be monitoring the comments and hopefully be able to get all of your questions in at the end after the discussion, and it will be about an hour. So, Kirsty, Tim, hello, good morning. Thank you for being with us.
Morning.
Let's start with you, Tim, because your company created this survey. Can you give us a bit of background on Leesman and yourself?
Yeah, well, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And looking forward to some sparring with Kirsty in a bit. So I started Leesman back in 2010, based on a concept of understanding at a very deep level, statistically, how employees interact with their space. So certainly with human factors and ergonomics as one of the many moving parts of what we were very much keen to understand at a deeper level. So we launched back in 2010. The aim then to provide a wholly independent assessment technique and a rating scale for employee experience of workplace. In the 10 years since, established the business as a global enterprise, effectively, clients using our tool across more than 100 countries. Pre-COVID, sitting on more than 750,000 employee responses to exactly the same assessment technique. So without doubt, the largest resource of its kind to understand how employees interact with corporate workspace. Now, of course, COVID came along, and we were sitting on proudly sitting on a research tool and an assessment tool of corporate workplace, and suddenly everybody was not in corporate workplace. So about February time, some of our Asian clients started reaching out to us and saying, we're going to need your help because we're going to be sending people home. And when they're at home, they're going to be there for some time. And we also then need to know how their homes are working in supporting their roles within our organization. What could you do for us? And I'll be totally frank, I think the first couple of calls we had were not a lot. We assessed corporate workplace until you realize that, and maybe this was a bit of a British thing, that COVID's their problem, not our problem. And suddenly it starts to sort of come around the globe. And so by around about the end of February, we took a commitment to develop a new tool that would measure in exactly the same way, using exactly the same methodology, the ability of employees' homes or their remote work settings to support their role within the organization in exactly the same way. We published about 3 weeks ago some data on the first 50,000 responses, but just to give you an indication of the adoption rate of the tool, we're now sitting on over 125,000 employee responses with the exact same question. So literally, pacing at about 10,000 responses a week. In terms of how global organizations are using this tool to try and understand what is going on with their newly dispersed colleagues.
Great, thanks. Kirsty, can you tell us about the Travelling Ergonomist and maybe what your recent experience has been now that more of your clients are working from home?
Definitely. Tim, that's amazing. Over 100,000 respondents. Oh my gosh, that is incredible. I'm looking forward to chatting about that shortly. So as a traveling ergonomist, I historically before the pandemic was traveling probably on a weekly basis around Europe, the UK and internationally. And obviously because of everything that's happening right now, I've been halted to my home office, and it's been a bit of a transition, I'm sure, for many, and I've been noticing that a lot with my clients. As you can imagine, I've become one of the most popular people amongst my friendship groups ever. They never listened to a word I said to them the last 10 years when I was talking about, guys, you need to set up your workstations properly, get some good chair, get some good equipment, get some training for yourselves. They didn't listen to a word. As soon as the pandemic happened, Kirsty was on the phone every hour of the day, offering advice and shipping some of my spare equipment that I had in the home. So yeah, it's been an interesting transition, but I think as a discipline for ergonomics and human factors, this has really helped us to gain a lot of visibility to the science of ergonomics. It's been around for the last, few decades, and people have started to slowly get to grips with what it means and how it can help and benefit. But I don't think really that's happened until the last sort of 4 or 5 months. And in a what's a very traumatic and chaotic world right now, there is some hope that has come out of it, and hopefully some really good change that will come out of it as well.
Great, thanks. So to kick off with some questions, Tim, did the survey results indicate how people were actually feeling about working from home? And if so, was it in a positive or negative light overall?
Yeah, a good place to start, I guess, in terms of that sort of overall sentiment expression. It's one of the things that we measure is employee sentiment. We use a series of key performance indicators for it. And I guess the tabloid headlines that you're reading in the national and international press would paint a picture that, that there are a number of stress lines already, but that generally home is working. And that, the genie is out of the lamp, it's not going back in. And I think generally our data supports that the world has been taught a lesson or two about the trust that it can invest in employees to work in remote locations. And generally speaking, if we look at the sort of global headlines, home working is working actually better than office working on average, on aggregate. The challenge is, of course, that averages mask significant highs and lows. And as soon as we get into the weeds and we start understanding what's happening right down at the bottom level, the disparities are colossal and really some of them quite disturbing. So I suppose the sort of next layer of dialogue is around the fact that there are some activities that home is supporting way better than the average workplace, but there are also some activities for employees that the home is very much struggling to support. So when it comes to sort of rolling up and talking about sentiment expression and emotion, it's a really, really mixed picture. It really depends what the employee is doing in their role and the environment that they have available to them at home. It's that sort of, it's a very complex matrix, a sort of Venn diagram, if you can imagine, of many, many circles that is directly influencing the overall outcome. So the differences inside organizations are often much greater than they are across the overall sample if we look at it as a whole. So a complex picture on the thing.
Right. And I think when we chatted earlier, the data showed some interesting behaviors linked to connectivity. And when I first read that question, I was thinking, oh, technology and support, but also the human connectivity. Did you see anything in the results about that?
Yeah, so this is really intriguing. I think that if we'd been debating this a year ago, I think we would have all assumed that technology would actually have been the biggest challenge for employees to suddenly disperse. Most of the CTOs that we're around internationally, frankly, are sat at home polishing their halos. The technology has done blisteringly well for almost every employee, and their digital connectivity is not an issue at all. The challenge for employees is staying connected to the organization, connected to their colleagues in a much more emotionally intelligent, empathetic type way. Those are where the principal challenges are sitting at the moment. And we're already seeing some really intriguing features, even based on gender. I'm not going to do this is a bit of a spoiler alert, perhaps, for a seminar that we'll be running when we process that 125 sample size. But we believe we're seeing some principal stress lines around things like the homework setting that you're dialing in from, if you're on a call like this, impacting your sense of connectivity socially to colleagues and organization, but also gender may also be starting to spike from a data perspective in terms of social connectivity to colleagues and organizations. So some real cool stuff coming through there.
And Kirsty, have you noticed some similar things with your clients who I assume more of them are working from home than they were before?
Yeah, I think much the same as what Tim has highlighted. There's definitely peaks and troughs to everyone's home working scenario. So yes, of course, home working has reduced that horrible commute for a lot of people. But for others, for someone like me, that commute was actually a time for me to actually relax and read my book, listen to my podcast. And I probably do that less now at home because I wake up and I go straight to work. So for me, that commute was part of my health and well-being regime, whereas I know for others the commute is absolutely horrendous. I used to live in London, and so traveling through the tube to the city centre is not the most ideal scenario. So I do understand that nuance of commuting, but certainly home working has its benefits. We can create the environment we want to create now. We have the autonomy to do what we want and design the space the way we want to, because it's our home. We're not going into an office that's been designed by a group of designers and architects who, yes, will have maybe asked us some questions, but ultimately it's probably a business sense that is the way it's been designed. So at home we can have a much more autonomy around that. The only problems I'm obviously seeing is from an ergonomics perspective, the lack of equipment or the lack of good equipment, and as Tim mentioned earlier, the lack of space for a lot of people. Certainly in the UK, we're not known for big houses and big plots of land. We have smaller houses as opposed to the likes of American houses, which do seem to be a little bit bigger, certainly outside the city. So I think that maybe that will start to change the construction industry and the way we build houses in the future as well.
Okay, great. And I know many, sorry, go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to amplify Kirsty's point there. I think there are many changes beyond workplace that societally we've really got to get our heads around, and not just we as individuals, but I think the profession, the architectural design community, the workplace strategy community, real estate brokers, right the way through the food chain, have to, I think, understand that if we are expecting employees to work from home, we're intruding corporately on people's private lives in a very, very space-hungry way. And so one of the big interesting data shifts we've seen is the amount of people who have a designated space for work at home, but that is not enclosed. Now, what that tells us is pre-COVID, that was quite a small group. That group has grown significantly post-COVID. So the sofa surfers have a massive issue with having space at home. But in recognizing that sofa surfing isn't a good way of working, and trying to create little corners and little spaces to work at home where they do recognize that their own personal ergonomic situation needs to be thought through. But suddenly, I think that the implication there is that we're stealing space in people's homes. That's not fair and reasonable, I think. So there are the wins. There's no commute. There's greater control, greater autonomy. But we've also got to, I think, balance that with the idea that we're literally stealing real estate from our employees back, or from them, for the benefit of the corporate organisation. I think society is going to start asking itself a few questions about those types of issues.
Yeah, in your opinions, who would bear that responsibility in making sure that someone's home working setup was healthy and ergonomic? Because I know for many of us, we were thrown into this unique situation where from one day to the next, we were asked to work from home. So it's understandable that many of us did not have a proper desk or task chair or even space in the home to do that. But now that more people are probably going to continue to work from home, or at least more than they were before, in your opinion, who bears that responsibility of making sure that they are working in a healthy way?
I think I think you could run a day-long webinar where you would need a panel of lawyers representing different jurisdictions to properly answer that question. I think this is a societal question, and I think the challenge I think that we're seeing for our clients is that employee perception will change as we long tail, hopefully, out of COVID. So I think at the moment, societally, we have a sense of sort of esprit de corps. We're collectively fighting an invisible enemy. And so we are willing, under instruction from our governments and from our employers, to make certain concessions from a lifestyle perspective in order to try and get out of this faster. Once we're out of it, I think our perception of what we're willing to accept will change. So we might suffer not having a remote monitor screen, or we might suffer not having an ergonomic chair at home for a month or two. Suddenly a month or two is turning into 6 months to a year. What happens after Christmas? I think this is what we've got to really start to consider, and where the cool organizations that we're around are already thinking way, way, way beyond Q1 next year. And they're starting to sort of build infrastructures and support mechanisms and supply chains to address exactly that question. But in terms of legal responsibility, I park that with the lawyers. I'm not even going to dare to go onto that one. But Kirsty may have some views in terms of the UK, certainly.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people assume that it's the health and safety team's job to handle this. You know, that makes sense to a lot of people. But the reality is it's not just the health and safety professional's job to help us at home. It's a collective in the business. It has to be the procurement team, the IT team, the health and safety team, facilities. And we do need some representation from the staff members. How do they want to work from home? You know, we can't just make those assumptions. So I think not siloing people into these jobs that are going to fix us all. It's actually this collective of bringing everyone around the table and having a really open and honest discussion, saying, what do we need? What do we want? And who's going to take action in what area? The health and safety team might end up being the team that do sort of drive what's going on with people at home, but they certainly shouldn't be the only team that are at the forefront of navigating that. The health and safety executive have suggested that working from home at the moment doesn't require a DSE assessment because we're classed as temporary home workers, and that there is little to no further risk of being at home than in the office. Now, from my perspective, that's absolute nonsense, because as I'm sure many people listening to this right now have experienced over the last few months, some kind of ache and pain from working from home with the lack of equipment. We know that people were suffering with issues in the office with equipment and good equipment. Of course, we're going to suffer with issues at home with no equipment. So yeah, it's certainly something we need to consider further. And yeah, I think I'm on Tim's wavelength there. We'll leave it to the lawyers to maybe handle that aspect of it.
Kirsty, like you mentioned, in London, we don't have a lot of space, people living in apartments in any big city around the world. If someone is living in a small space where they're sharing, you know, their home or their flat with other family members or other flatmates, and they don't have a proper work from home setup, they don't have a task chair or a desk, and they can't invest in that right now, is there still one thing they can do to improve their setup just by using what they have around the house?
It's a really good question. I think, you know, if I think back to my early 20s when I moved to London, I was living in a house share with 4 or 5 other people. And if I was looking to work there now in this pandemic, you'd all be rushing to the dining room table to get that kind of space, because otherwise, where else would you work other than the sofa and couch surfing? So I think from my perspective, if there's one thing that I had to choose for everybody, it would be to get yourself some kind of table or unit where you can at least put your devices, your equipment on something, so that you can then position that more, you know, ergonomically or just in a better position for your body. If you don't have a flat surface to put your equipment on, then you are going to be placing that on your lap. You're going to be slouching in awkward postures. So a flat surface, whether that's a coffee table, ideally, you know, at a good height as well, but whatever we can find to at least encourage a better position for our tools to come closer to us, I think would be the most ideal.
Right. And Tim, did the survey go into anything about acoustics in the home versus work? This is something I've experienced personally working from home with my husband, who talks on the phone a lot. So I was wondering if anybody else had experience with the difference between, you know, acoustics and finding quiet and focus time at home versus the office.
Yeah, absolutely, Lauren. So the fundamental issue we're seeing there is that anything that requires acoustic privacy in terms of a work activity, generally speaking, we're seeing that better supported at home. So, you know, unlike perhaps some of the colleagues that, you know, I have, or I'm sure you know, we all have friends who are contending with children and you know, partners and others being in the house. Generally are smaller numbers, right? And to Kirsty's earlier point in terms of autonomy, you've probably got greater influence you can exercise over the volume of your husband's phone call than you would over Jane's phone call if she was in the showroom with you or anybody else around you, right? So it's if it's acoustic privacy you're after, and that activity in your work benefits from acoustic privacy, then home generally is performing way better than the average contemporary office. It's other areas around sort of collaboration and the ability, I think, to engage both acoustically and visually in these types of activities. It takes an entirely different energy source, I think, to listen to a 1-hour webinar than it would to sit in a room with the 3 of us for an hour and consume some knowledge transfer collectives. So I think we also need to be, I think, conscious of the type of acoustics that we're suffering at home. I think it's a different type of resonant frequency, and it's a different type of landscape that's created. So whilst you might have more control over it, the type and nature of it that you're receiving in a working day, I don't think is particularly healthy either. So yeah, mixed picture, I'm afraid. I don't have any direct answers or advice, but I think it's something that we're going to see increasingly people starting to challenge, which is beneficial, office or home in that respect.
I think as well, what's interesting to me is when you're in your space, you don't often you don't know what the other person is listening to or hearing, so you can't fathom what their acoustics is. So for example, you might have heard my dog barking earlier a couple of minutes ago. I could hear him, really loudly, so it starts to trigger me thinking, oh my gosh, he's so loud. You may not have noticed that at all, but for me, it's been a real kind of distraction to listen to that, coming off of this. So I think it's also that nuance of what is the other person experiencing compared to what we're experiencing as well.
Right. Kirsty, that comes down to sort of personal emotional intelligence, right? Yeah. And that's we know from historic research, that's a really hard thing to teach employees. So, for those on the call, we did a dress rehearsal of the technology a few days ago, and we were joking about those people who are sofa surfing with their laptops on their lap aren't appreciating that for the person on the other end of the video call, it actually can make you pretty seasick watching somebody else sort of dodging around as their monitor and the camera move around. So I think those are some skills that can be taught. And I'm not aware of many organizations who've actually taken on board a sort of learning and development program for how to engage with each other through these types of platforms from remote locations. So the dog barking is a distraction. It's distracting you. We can't hear it. I've got CBRE building their new corporate headquarters to our office in Winchester. It's really distracting me out of the window, but maybe you can't hear it. So I think that's a really key point in terms of emotional intelligence and empathy for those people you're collaborating with when you're working from a remote location. Whereas in the office, actually we sort of don a corporate behavior. You walk across the threshold in the morning and you turn from being a person to being an employee. And I don't think that's the same when you're working remotely. I think we don't have that sort of fairy dust sprinkled on us each morning when we put on our corporate uniform, we buy our coffee from the corner coffee shop, we come and sit at a desk in our ergonomically matching chairs, and we start behaving in a similar way. I think at home, people are behaving in many different ways, and that will start, I think, to sort of creep into organizations, a sort of disbursement or a dilution of corporate value.
Yeah, that's definitely different. I'm just noticing when we did the dress rehearsal for the webinar to test out the technology, most of us were working from home at the time, and now I think there are more, including Jane, who you can't see, more of us are working in our office space. And I was wondering what you two thought of the future of work. I know people use that a lot, the term, but can we look at it in a positive light? And is there a way we can make the working from home and the working in the office more fluid for the future? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think as we mentioned before, I think for me personally, the office now has to become somewhere that is going to offer me an experience that I don't get at home. So, for example, for me, I'm currently in my bedroom because the office downstairs has been occupied by someone else. I've had to turn my screen in the corner so you don't see my bed in the background. So I need to go to a space where maybe I can go to the Flokk showroom where I have a lot more open space and I can be around really beautiful furniture that a young person might not be able to afford at this time of my life, but I still want to be around such beauty and aesthetic. So that experience I want to go to and experience as well. And it comes down to, I think we spoke about this, Tim, is this embarrassment of space for a lot of people working from home. Not everybody does have a spare office or a home study to work from, and they have to work from their bedroom. But not everybody wants to show that side of their life to the rest of the world or their employees. That's just this dichotomy that doesn't quite work. And I think that's where the office becomes really crucial and valuable to us versus home working.
Yeah, totally aligned. And I think the future looks promising, right? In that, you know, the genie is out of the lamp and it's not going back in. So home working has been exposed to millions of employees who, you know, just a matter of weeks ago were not trusted to work from home. I think this is something we also need to think about in terms of corporate emotional intelligence. Suddenly, not only were employees trusted to work from home, but they were given a mobile device, which they'd never been afforded or allowed. So I think there's a bit of a sort of crisis of trust that may be looming, though, as and when we can en masse go back to the workplaces. I think quite many people would want to go back. But if, when they go back, their employer says, okay, that's great, I'll have that laptop back, thanks very much. And those days you're working from home, we're now going to have to work out how many there are that you're allowed. I think there's an awful lot of employees who say, hang on a minute, we had 22 weeks when you told me I had to work from home and you were perfectly trusting of me doing it. And now you're questioning whether that's something that is okay. And I think organizations are going to have to go through some really quite rocky seas in terms of, you know, that sort of emotional relationship in terms of trust that they vest in employees over that period. I think employees will want to come back, but I think they will also say, on my terms, thanks very much. And I think then the next challenge for that is, on which days is it? Right? An awful lot of employees are going to say, I'm happy to come in on a Tuesday and a Wednesday and a Thursday. Is it okay if I work at home on a Monday and a Friday? And you know, that for a real estate executive and for an HR team is a minefield of sort of, you know, imposing rules and regulations that are then going to just throw the whole thing back up.
Great, definitely. I'm just getting some questions coming in on the comments. So we have one from Nicholas Madsen. The question is, what are your thoughts regarding work culture and leadership, and how should we handle this when people are working from home?
Kirsty,
I know Tim, you can start.
That's a very deep question there, a massive question. I think from a leadership perspective, I know this gets kind of bandied around a lot, but it really is down to communication and understanding what your employees want. And don't just play lip service to that. Don't just ask the question because you have to ask the question. Ask it because you're genuinely going to take on their feedback and do something with it, because otherwise you've just wasted a whole lot of resources pushing that data. It would be like using the Leesman index, paying for that and using it and getting all the really great data and then not doing anything with it. What would be the point of that? The whole point of collecting data is to do something with it. So I think having leadership that is able to translate what we've collected and put that into a real action plan going forward is super, super important. And as I say, just understanding the language that comes from people as well. I think we spoke about this before, is not just using data as numbers and quantitative data, it's qualitative data. Actually, what is the language, or what is the language that people are using? What words are they using to describe their home working setup, or how they're feeling about working in this space, or how they're feeling about potentially going back to the office? Like, understanding that language, I think, is definitely going to future-proof how we then work forward. So having leadership that understands that and is going to actively encourage that open communication. You know, as we said, I think Tim just mentioned that we've opened the can of worms now. Like, it's done. We can't close the can of worms. It's out there. They're crawling around now. So let's take that on board and really make something good and positive out of this.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Nicholas. I think if you want to read more about it, check out, there's a long read or a blog that I wrote for the latest edition of the Leesman Review, which is our fourth publication journal on the empathetic emotional intelligence organization. So I would check that. And the other one I would suggest you might want to look at, I'm not going to do any conclusions, but on the same day, two very famous San Francisco-based tech companies announced different strategies. One of them said that because employees could work from home indefinitely, should they wish to, but if they did so, they had to notify the organization, because they may see a salary reduction, because if they were moving out of the Bay Area, clearly it was much cheaper, and therefore the organization should benefit from the lower residential costs that employee might have. One of their peer organizations, just as big and just as well known, did something slightly differently. They gave every employee $1,000 to invest in their home ergonomics. which organisation would you prefer to work for in a talent management war for talent? I know which one I would gravitate towards. So I think that's where organisations can exercise their sort of emotional intelligence and the connection and their sensitivity towards the needs of employees in the moment.
My only caveat, Tim, to that is this is the only thing we're going to spar on here, maybe. The organisation that are giving $1,000 to each of their staff is absolutely incredible. I mean, you definitely need that amount of money to set up your home setup. You do that. You know, £100 is not going to cut it. That's going to get you a laptop stand and maybe a keyboard. But I hope that the company that are doing that are not just palming off their responsibilities to their staff members by saying, here's the money, now you sort it out. Because if that's the case, then we're going to see a further set of issues, because people aren't educated on ergonomics. They don't know what equipment to choose, really. That's the likes of our jobs to help with that. So yes, giving someone, what's the saying, you can bring a horse to water but not force them to drink, is that kind of thing. So I hope that with that sort of financial benefit comes some training and extra resource with that as well.
So $1,000 for furniture and a hotline to the grounded ergonomist. Okay.
That's right. We have a comment from Paul Skinner, who says new UK houses are the smallest in Europe. So I don't know if he's thinking of maybe, is that going to change now that people want to have or trying to have a separate office space in the house? I mean, I've read somewhere in some of the newspapers that there are more people looking at houses outside the commuter belt because they can work from home for more days a week, so they don't mind coming in to the big cities once a week or twice a week with a longer commute, but they have a bigger house or bigger space for their office. I don't know if you two have seen this happening with your clients.
We do a lot of work with the RICS, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and I think they are about to publish, if they haven't already done so, some similar research from estate agents, which is looking at simple things like bedroom count. And so regardless of size, I think people are looking for a separate space. You know, whether or not the UK or London has the smaller houses than the rest of Europe, I'm not sure. I think that's a data point that needs to be checked. I think some of my friends living in the middle of Paris would argue in the opposite direction. But certainly, what's interesting in the data is that some of the what do you want to call them, sort of pre-assumptions that we might have had about some cities, like central New York or central London, central Hong Kong, where domestic real estate costs are amongst the highest in the world. Whilst there are challenges for those employees, it doesn't appear to be a singular driving factor in terms of the sort of domestic setting. It is more about whether you have an assigned space at home you can close the door on for work, than it is the city. So I think even if it's a tiny space, or to Kirsty's point earlier, it's a North American client who's got a barn at the end of the garden that they call their private office, it's more about the ability to have an isolated space than it is about the volume of space you afford yourself with when creating that home work environment.
I completely agree with that. There's lots of, in fact, over the last couple of months, there's been lots of innovation around furniture design and equipment design, and there's lots of manufacturers, certainly I know in the UK, who are creating products where it's like a booth, so you can kind of close the door on your chair and desk. Maybe it's in the corner of your lounge, close it off, and you've closed it off now for the evening, and then just slide it back open again for that work time. So I think, and they're tiny, they're maybe 1 meter wide. So having something you can close off and put to bed ready for your evening, I think is what is ideal and what is going to be looked at further. And for me personally, I'm more interested in less what's inside the house, more can I get to nature? Can I get outside to a garden? And can I get outside this space? That's more interesting to me personally, and I think for a lot of people as well.
I think, Lauren, I know we're being hosted, Kirsty and I, by a furniture designer and manufacturer, but I think that this is where the furniture industry is sort of caught between a rock and a hard place as well. So, Kirsty's right. We're seeing heaps of products being quickly developed and brought to market that enable sort of discrete homework settings. But there's a risk there of you ambulance chasing a situation that may not be long term. So I think there's a heap of risks for you as an industry there. I also think you're challenged by something that I'm sure you'll vehemently disagree with, but the better the ergonomic product, frankly, the uglier it tends to be. And so,
do we? You can comment on that, Tim.
As you squirm in your chair. But do we want ugly products in our homes? And I think that the industry is going to have to come to terms, I think, with the idea that it probably does need to bring products to market that feel more domestic, but have the functionality and the engineering and ergonomics of existing high-performance commercial products. So I think there is a cool opportunity, I think, for the contract furniture industry to domesticate its aesthetic without compromising its functional effectiveness.
It's an interesting comment, Tim, because I recently, over the last couple of months, have been interviewed by a couple of large of the magazines, BBC World News, Which magazine, and they keep coming to me and saying, Kirsty, out of these 5 retailers, which chairs would you choose to recommend for people working from home? And I just open and click the links, and I'm like, guys, I'm really sorry. I wouldn't recommend any of these. They're, first of all, not ergonomic, and second of all, really ugly. Like, no one's going to want these in your office or your home office or home space. So I think there is a great opportunity to change this. I happen to be in a hard Capisco, which I do quite like in my bedroom. It does fit nicely under my desk and is a great colour scheme for me personally. It does look a bit wacky, but that's my aesthetic, so maybe it works for me. But yeah, you're right. I think there's a good opportunity for future innovation and design in this industry.
Yeah, and I guess it helps if you can choose the finishes as well. If there's a wide range of finishes that you can, help it make look a bit more residential, more so than commercial in your home office. We have a question from Peter Crompton. How much disruption are survey respondents seeing from video calls in the office?
Really good question. We're not asking about that particular aspect just yet, but it is something that we're warning clients of based on the data we're seeing. So we're seeing a huge drop in the importance attached to telephone calls and a huge increase in the importance attached to video. And so our prediction as employees start to creep back to the office is that they will equally expect to take video calls at their desk. And so actually an already challenged acoustic landscape in the open plan office will be even more acutely challenged. Now, an employee might say, well, that's fine, I'll put headphones in. But we also know as soon as somebody puts a headset on, they elevate the volume of their voice because they can't hear the volume of their own voice. And actually, they're making the situation far worse. So I think landscape designers, workplace designers are going to have to get used to providing many, many more short stretch, acoustically private spaces for an employee to be able to grab the laptop and go and take the call in an acoustically private space. My only request, please, is if you're putting phone booths in offices, please put air circulation in those spaces. Otherwise it's nothing more than a vertical coffin. They're awful. The majority of spaces that I see that are passing as phone booths are not phone booths at all. They're nothing more than broom cupboards. So if you're going to do it properly and let it be a space that an employee actually can use ergonomically and acoustically for an hour-long call.
Have you done research on that, Tim, for people at home, the air quality at home? Because obviously that's something that gets talked about and implemented in an office, but not necessarily in our homes. We don't think about air quality and air purification here, but it's equally as important, I think.
Yeah, we chose not to ask that question in the new survey because I think it's something that we ask about temperature control and air quality. And whilst some employees might have the privilege of a temperature they can control at home or maybe even air conditioning, most don't. And so we decided not to overburden the home working questionnaire with that. But I think it does come back to your earlier points around control. The assumption that we're making, and many others who are interested in indoor environment quality have historically recorded, is that the more control you can exercise, the higher your satisfaction. So, in the office, you're having to sort of federally accept the temperature that is deemed appropriate for you, and that the old we should really have floors for women and floors for men in terms of the debates and the fights that happen in this office over who's in charge of the air conditioning temperature. That doesn't happen at home, so you can exercise a little bit more of your own freedom at home. I think it's probably another thing that's looming for offices as we come back together, because we've had months of being our own captains of our own ship in terms of what we're doing at home, when we do it, what we wear, all of those types of factors. So we're suddenly coming back into the office and having to accept to be a good citizen again around our co-workers. So some behaviours that might have to be retaught as we return.
Definitely. I think that cognitive aspect is the most important thing going forward.
We've got another one from Peter. Are we in danger of creating cells in offices that does the opposite of helping collaboration? One of the main reasons people might go back to the office.
Yeah, I suppose that's a question in direct challenge of my last statement about the need for more cellular space. But I used to be a designer, heavily involved in workplace, moved into strategy, even more interested in workplace landscapes and before I started Leesman. The stark reality is there's an awful lot of open plan workspaces that don't work very well for the employees who are using them. So as much as designers might like them, as much as real estate executives might like them because they're efficient and they're interesting spaces to design, suck it up, guys. There's an awful lot of open plan workplaces that are disastrous for the employees trying to use them. Flip side of that is there are also a whole load of incredibly good open plan workplaces. So the challenge is to understand what makes open plan work well for the employees who are using it. And the data is there. It'll take us an hour-long webinar just to debrief you on the data. But there are aspects of open plan working that enable employees to do the work that they're employed to do incredibly well. They're not difficult to understand, I don't think, but they require some restraint and they require some sort of deep sort of design empathy, if you like. They are not compatible with the densification of space. So if you have a client who's trying to simply fit more people into more space, call it densification, don't call it open plan for collaboration. They're very different things. So I think call a spade a spade.
I like that.
We've got one from Philip Connolly. He says, having worked from home for the first time in the last 2 weeks, I can honestly say I have never worked so hard and for so long. Benefits obviously include no commute, but do the panel feel my experience is commonplace?
I suppose if I just briefly answer that, your personal experience will change over time. And so many employees, I think in the first 2 to 3 weeks were in that sort of period of excitement and period of change, and it was liberating if they were not able to do that before. But I think their sentiment is already drifting. We're now, 22 weeks, 23 weeks into that period, and I think our emotional journey is roller coastering down to that sort of ebb as the thing comes to a stop. But I'd also give a moment to those people in a different circumstance. So for me, home used to be a place that I would retreat. My role as the CEO was heavily involved in traveling to all of our overseas territories and clients. And if I was in the office, you were pulled in all sorts of different directions to spar with different parts of projects and different team members on different things. So I would very rarely go to the office for concentrated work. I would put a day in my diary to work remotely from home for concentration. That concentration has been decimated. So literally our work for all of us has been turned upside down. So for me, home was about being off grid. And suddenly I'm on grid from 6:30 in the morning until 8:30 in the evening working from home. It's awful. I'm desperate to find an off-grid space that I can retreat to, because currently I don't have one.
I think my experience is probably the same. I'm very optimistic. I'm a very kind of open person. So sort of May, June, July, or April, May, June, July, I was very kind of positive about this. I was like, yes, we can get loads of work done. This is great. And then very quickly, sort of middle of July, I definitely felt some burnout there, because I was working, as you, 6 in the morning till 8 o'clock at night, just answering text messages and emails and then being on screen. And that doesn't lead to a healthy, it's not sustainable long term. So we do have to manage that a little bit better. I think we are now starting to think about that a little bit more efficiently going forward, because it's not sustainable. We will burn out, and that's not good for any business or people.
Yeah, and I think, Kirsty, you mentioned this before, even if you don't have a separate home office or alcove or something with a desk and a attached chair, just closing your computer, putting it away as a signal to yourself that it's home time now, because it's hard, the office has kind of invaded our home space, which we weren't really used to before. We've got a question from Asa Boquist. Will we return to quote unquote normal in the near future, or is working from home the new normal?
Kirsty, you go first.
Working from home isn't new. That I think people have there's a misconception around that. Working from home isn't new. Working from home for this length of time and this many people at once is what's new. So that nuance of working from home definitely isn't new. So I don't think we could call that the new normal. I don't really know what the new normal is. I think the new normal will be how we interact with the office and the home. There's very likely most of us are going to want to work from home at least once a week, at the very least, if not maybe 2 days a week. So it's understanding how does that work? How does that work from the team's perspective and the real estate that we own and have as well? How does that all work? As we said, we don't want everybody coming into the office, on a Wednesday or Thursday, and then everyone staying at home on a Friday and Monday. That just then doesn't work at all either. But if that's the case, then maybe that's where these co-working spaces do become much more valuable to us, because we now don't have and bear the expense of a building. We can just rent out those spaces as and when we need them. There are a couple of leasing companies that have started in the last 3 or 4 months leasing furniture to companies who work from home. So rather than you as a business buying 100 chairs and 100 desks for people's home office, leasing them for a 12-month period, that's starting to occur now. So I think just the way we procure furniture and the way we do things will change. But yeah, the new normal, I'm not exactly sure I can predict that just yet. I think we're still figuring it all out.
I think, Asad, my response would be around the future is uncertain. None of us can see what the future represents. So I think it's a risky business trying to predict it. I think the one thing, though, that I would say that we can see is the likelihood that change is going to be a thing that we have to get used to. And so there's an amazing opportunity to innovate at a pace that we've never had the opportunity to innovate at before. So, I think in the next 12 months, you'll see 12 years worth of innovation. But as a result, you will also be making many, many more mistakes. Because innovation and change, so if you think about all the mistakes you've made in the last 12 years, you're going to make that many mistakes in the next 12 months. And I think that's the one thing that organizations, maybe that sort of fail fast mentality that technology developers are used to. It's something that the corporate real estate and interior design industry needs to get used to as well. So, used to change. I think that's the one thing.
You're absolutely right. I think even just this concept of freelancers and people, being digital nomads, that has been occurring the last decade already. And those people have sort of figured out how they want to work, where they want to work. And I think that now we're just more of us are going to maybe go that route to have a bit more autonomy about what we do.
We've got a question from Matt Webb. Do your studies note the change in people's mental health while working from home? Do you find an increased risk? And if so, can professional home work setup help?
Yeah, awesome question, Matt. So if we had been doing this webinar a year ago, there would have undoubtedly been a statement made by somebody around the benefits of working from home in rebalancing a healthier work-life balance. If you look at our data, and it's available on the website, you can pull down the tabular data, and you'll see that maintaining a healthy work-life balance is languishing at the bottom of the league table of our key performance indicators. So whilst it may be relatively high in its score, it's the lowest scoring of our 10 key performance indicators from an employee perspective. I think a lot of that comes down to that ability to close the door on the office. And I think there's then also a whole number of factors which were very, very difficult to measure before and perhaps even more difficult to reflect on now. So, Kirsty mentioned the commute. For me, the commute was not something that was necessarily you'd ever class or put in a sentence with the word pleasurable or welcome, but actually it was a period of sort of, if you like, preparation. You know, so my 35 minutes, 40 minutes on the train into London would have been checking emails from the night before. You know, I'd have bought a coffee from Hassan on the coffee shop on the station, had a bit of banter about the football. I hate football, he loves football. And then in the evening, you've got the reverse, right? So you walk out of the office, you've got a 15-minute, 20-minute walk to the station, a 35-minute decompression on the train going home. And you walk through the door and sit down in a domestic setting. And I think those are the types of things that are very, very difficult to understand what impact they had on mental well-being. My last point, though, on mental wellness also and well-being is, as a manager, I think a high empathy, high quality manager can see an employee in their team who may be suffering from some imbalances. Very, very much more difficult to see that on a Zoom call and to sense that. You know, you can see huddles disappearing off if there's negativity amongst a team when you're in their company. You can't see that happening when they're on WhatsApp working remotely. So I think there's a huge area here that needs very, very deep investigation. Our data touches on it, but I don't think it's anywhere near enough to understand the implications on a work-life balance and mental well-being.
I'm experiencing that as well with some of the clients that I'm working with. There's been instances where they'll put on these, you know, these weekly sort of team calls for half an hour, just so everyone can check in and have a little open conversation with each other. Not really work chat, just how's everyone doing? The problem with that is not everybody on those calls enjoys doing that in front of everybody and outlaying what they're feeling to the whole team. That's just not normal for some people, and then they start to retreat and they feel very uneasy. And that's actually been quite a big problem. Is for some people, doing that on a team call like this would be great. It's fun, we get to interact for once a week. For others, it's the worst call of their week and they hate it. So as you say, Tim, I think it's understanding each of those team members' personalities and how they tend to work better. I think we don't know that well enough yet, and we need to get better at that from a leadership perspective.
Even, Lauren, if you think about, you know, just that interaction, if the three of us had been in the showroom having that conversation, you and I would have been sort of agreeing or commenting on what Kirsty's just said in that sort of last 90 seconds as you did it. So you'd be retorting with sort of like a no way, or yeah, I know exactly what you, whilst the sentence was going on. Right, so actually we've had to change the way we communicate, because we no longer can talk at the same time in each other's company. It's my turn, Kirsty's turn, your turn, you know, and then you reverse the order. And I think it's created a really sort of, you know, segmented, sort of almost like domino fashion way of communicating that I don't feel is anywhere near as powerful in terms of understanding each other's viewpoints and trading sort of creativity and that emotional intelligence. You just can't do it in the same way through the electronic medium.
Yeah, I think, Kirsty, you mentioned this at the start of the call, probably before we were online, that you miss presenting in real life because you get people's immediate reactions, and that feedback is really important when you are having a conversation with someone. So I definitely agree with that. I think we just have time for a couple more questions. We've got one from Jane Allen. She says, in Sweden, there are rules about who has responsibility about the ergonomics when working from home. Do you know how the situation is in other countries? I think we briefly touched about this in terms of the UK, but have you guys worked with clients in other countries where the situation is different?
It actually tends to be more, from my experience, business to business different. So some companies, it might be the HR team that run the program. Others, it might be the health and safety team. In other organizations, it's the facilities team, because they're the ones who procure furniture and implement that furniture in the office or at home. So I think it depends from more of a business where that leadership has gone in that direction. A lot of the time it's health and safety, because it just makes sense that that's the case. But the problem with that is health and safety teams often don't have access to resources or budgets or the financial side of things, and it's difficult to fight for that if you don't have the freedom to do what you want with that budget. So that's where it becomes more difficult.
Yeah, Jane, you're right to point it out. I think it's Finland where the minute the employee closes the door on their house and starts to commute to work, the employer takes on a legal responsibility for their health and safety. So, yeah, hugely different laws around the world. I mean, you know, where that will start and end in terms of the debate, I don't think any of us know. I think, you know, we've also got, you know, tax authorities. They're going to start to sniff around this a little bit as well. So if you're providing ergonomic furniture from home, you know, with commercial support, suddenly you're going to be, in the UK at least, on a P11D as a taxable benefit. So, you know, should the employer be compensating for your tax loss as a result of looking after your ergonomics? There's some heaps of stuff still to be sorted out. If you're a real estate director or a facility manager or even one of the new sort of workplace experience global leads, the more countries your portfolio is dispersed across, the more complicated your job will be. I think that's about the only certainty I can offer on that topic.
Okay. Question from Bernard. Any data on absenteeism? So how is sick leave compared to when people were office-based? For the siren.
Good question. I hope that's not Bernard on my team, because he could have sent me a memo request on that one. But anyway, Bernard. Okay. Right.
I think it's Bernard on our team, maybe.
Okay, fine. Right. Good. So, Bernard, I think the situation here is really interesting from a data perspective. Actually, there's something that we would struggle to capture there around absenteeism. So you would routinely, as an example, if you're developing an activity-based working scheme a year ago, where employees could choose their setting best designed to support them, and if home was included in that, you will often see a reduction in absenteeism rates. Not because employees are healthier or they're getting sick less, but because they wake up with a snivel in the morning, and rather than historically thinking, well, to hell with that commute, I'm going to just stay at home and sign off sick for the day, they're actually sitting at home on the sofa and they're contributing and not signing in as absent for the day. So I think you're seeing a higher presence. Desperately trying not to use the word presenteeism because we're going to get into a whole other set of waters, but you will certainly be seeing a lower reported absenteeism rates. I don't think that means you've got a healthier workforce as a result. So be careful about the sort of cause and causation debate there around data points.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think certainly from the people that I'm working with, absenteeism does seem to have reduced, but not necessarily people's discomfort and pain and mental health issues. That still is very prominent. It's just that, exactly, if you've got a cold, I can just sit in bed and work on my laptop. It doesn't really affect me. Whereas before, if I woke up with a cold, do I want to go and sit in the office and be there? Maybe not so much. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, good. Our last question, because our hour is almost up, from Anthony Ingram. Any comment on the rise of predictability and the loss of spontaneity?
Yeah, so this is what we're referring to as the stuff you can't measure, Anthony. So it's you know, you can't diarize serendipity. On a Teams, you go to the webinar, Zoom call, you can't find the 5 or 10 minutes before the meeting as you know, walking down a corridor, bumped into somebody else who's coming into the meeting. I think we also, as well as the sort of positive aspects of spontaneity and creativity, we also need to think about the impacts of negativity and conflict. So if you've had a tough meeting, you know, what happens as you walk out of the space or as you bump into one of those colleagues in the coffee queue and you diffuse situations through being around each other afterwards is often, you know, one of the healthy aspects of conflict resolution. Those things are also not happening. So I think if you're going to think about the positivity or the aspects of the good stuff, please also cast your mind to some of the other immeasurables around the negatives as well.
Yeah, very fascinating.
So I think we're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Kirsty and Tim, for being with us this morning on our digital roundtable. And thank you everyone for logging in and for your questions. It has been recorded, so the whole webinar is recorded and they will be putting it up on our Flokk YouTube channel in the near future. If you would like more information on the Traveling Ergonomist or the Leesman Index, just go to the websites thetravelingergonomist.com and leesmanindex.com, and both Kirsty and Tim are available on LinkedIn. And I think that's it. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks for having us, Lauren. Okay, bye-bye, Kirsty.
Bye.